it's great to be back on stage once again at Pacific Bitcoin. This is Bitcoin mining and public policy. Once again, I'm Pete Rizzo, editor at Bitcoin Magazine, editor-at-large at Kraken, and author of Bitcoin and the American Dream, a book about U.S. policy that deals on mining. We'll be actually signing some books out there later. Joined again by Jason Less, CEO at Riot Blockchain, all the way on the end. In the middle, we've got Mr. Troy Cross, professor at Reed College and fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And last but not least, Mags Gronowska, did I get that? Advisor at PRTI. So again, going to be talking about mining. We'll start off with a bit of show of hands. How many people here are miners? How many people run their own equipment? Thank you for supporting the network. All right. So we'll dive into the panel today. Did some canvassing earlier, asking the audience some questions. Obviously, a trying time in the industry right now. Lots of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the headlines. We have FTX amidst uncertainty and catastrophe. Concerns about what this means for the industry. Obviously, we've seen the public Bitcoin mining companies, go through a period of stress and negativity. So we'd love to start with you, Jason. Where are we? What should people be concerned?
Should people be concerned about mining, the mining industry?
Yes.
I think that with mining, there are a lot of market variables that are outside of your control, or largely outside of your control. There's the price of Bitcoin, there's the network difficulty, and there's the price of power. And that final point often, I think, gets neglected in bull markets because the margins are so big in Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin's over 50,000, difficulties crushed because mining is banned in China, and it gave people a lot more of a focus on scale instead of cost. And I think now all of those variables are working against miners now, and it's really demonstrating who is prepared to survive different market conditions and who was a bit too short-sighted. Like the whole industry, I think, it's a process of cleansing. More efficient operators make it through, and everyone learns from those who do not.
Troy, can you maybe give us some insight? How are regulators looking at this? What do you think the impact will be of just increased scrutiny on the industry?
Well, I don't know what regulators are thinking, but my guess is that we'll experience some blowback that we don't necessarily deserve. I mean, the entire Bitcoin industry, but mining in particular, because I don't think in the popular imagination, people are so discriminating as to say, this is a problem for a particular part of the business, it's crypto, not Bitcoin. In the popular imagination, it's one thing. It's all one thing. Despite the efforts of places like Swan to draw that distinction. And now we're going to experience the blowback for the shortcomings of others, and it's really on us to make the case for the difference. But regulators are going to respond to the populace. The populace is responding to just people getting hurt and scammed. And so I kind of expect the worst.
Mags, interested in your take, obviously advising industries in the company. Companies in the industry. What would you be saying right now? What are you telling?
So I actually spent a decade in government, so I'm quite familiar.
Congratulations.
Yeah, I made it out. So there's twofold, right? There's the ESG piece, which we've been criticized for, and now we're going to be criticized for just being a scammy industry. Why are we even existing, right? And on the ESG front, I think the key piece that regulators need to know, because the EU is looking to ban proof of work, certain states are looking to ban it, Quebec right now is looking at some negative regulations. The key piece here that they need to understand is, Ethereum, proof of stake, CBDCs, none of those technologies are going to get us to carbon negative. Bitcoin mining is the only way we can get to carbon negative, and that is something that we need to do better as an industry to communicate.
Let's get some applause for that.
Yeah.
It is possible with Bitcoin.
It is.
Switching to something a bit more positive, Jason, you and I were talking backstage about Texas. It really seems like Texas has become a success story for the Bitcoin mining industry here in America. What's going well? How do we build off of it? And do you see it expanding out of Texas? Because right now it really does feel like a Texas story.
Yeah, so there's two angles I think about and how it's working well that are both important. And I think because of these things, Texas is demonstrating itself as an ideal energy market and a model for Bitcoin mining. And at first, I'll lean into the social aspect. Since Bitcoin miners are attracted to the lowest price energy they can find, in Texas, you are typically going to find those opportunities at scale in rural communities. So companies like Riot are coming into these rural communities and bringing Bitcoin and an entire industry that would not otherwise build there because it might require being closer to a population center. So we've had tremendous success building in and partnering with the communities that we operate in, and it's a very symbiotic relationship. We are bringing, we're bringing economics, jobs, tax base to these communities, and we are gaining people to work at our facility as well. So I think it's an incredible example from the social aspect. Now on the power aspect, I believe ERCOT is an ideal energy market. ERCOT is a deregulated energy market. There is a grid operator that is approving the addition of load and that entire mechanism, but the pricing is entirely market driven. And that's very key with how Bitcoin mining supports energy grid, because we don't respond to a central authority deciding you need to turn on now, you need to turn off now, etc. It is voluntary through a market. We respond to price signals, not politicians. And I think that is developing a great relationship where we are able to lower our cost of power, but also provide a consistent demand for power and not increase the peaks of power demand, but flatten the overall demand curve to improve the economics and visibility for generators. So I think as this grows, this time period is I think a speed bump in that, because not all the projects that said they were going to move forward will move forward. But overall, the benefit, the symbiotic relationship, I think is being demonstrated.
Maybe to Troy, to other U.S. states, are they looking at Texas? What are they hearing about? Are they seeing this as a positive story? How do we get the message out?
Yeah, the messaging is very tricky. You have something like Riot hedging their power expenses, and that hedge turning out very well for the company. It gets spun as Riot taking advantage of a shortage of power, right? Whereas it was an opportunity open to anyone, and I saw it as the market actually working, and also as the company being responsible to its shareholders, defending against exactly the kind of power price scenario that unfolded, right? So it's a hard story to tell. Bitcoin, while I looked recently at Riot's downtime. It's only 70% uptime a couple months ago. From a grid perspective, that's tremendous. That's flattening that curve. But how do we package that? It's a really difficult. It's a really difficult story to tell. The truth is, there's a hard educational task ahead of us. We have to teach people how electrical grids work.
So,
and that's not straightforward. I think once we tell that story, people will see that Bitcoin mining is good for the grid and it's actually good for decarbonizing the grid. But it's a major, major effort.
So, I worked for the Ministry of Energy, and that was the most, whenever briefing decks came out, they were the thickest ones because nobody understood it, in the public space. So I think as Bitcoiners, and especially in Bitcoin mining, not only do we have to explain the electricity sector, which is a big beast, it's like all these other aspects of Bitcoin that people can't wrap their heads around. But, sorry.
I think that big picture, we had a moment in Bitcoin mining history. We had high price of Bitcoin, price went from 3,000 to 69,000, right? We had a shortage of ASICs, a shortage of places to plug in. We had a mining ban in China. So we have this massive migration of ASICs to the US and Kazakhstan. Any power you can plug into is fine. Price of power doesn't matter because you're making money hand over fist printing Bitcoin. And in this moment, you just had a rush to plug in machines. Okay, here's the problem. That is the picture that lawmakers are still looking at, and regulators and media people. They've taken a snapshot of the mining industry at this very peculiar moment where basically we weren't that sensitive to price. And now we're moving into more what I think is a natural evolution of mining. I mean, it's the closest thing we've ever seen to a perfect market. ASICs are going to be cheap. They're going to drive to the cost of production for ASICs. We're going to find the cheapest stranded power in the world. Margins for mining are going to grind to nothing. And that's, it's kind of like, for me, it's kind of like watching the Nature Channel, like watching what's happening in the mining space. It's brutal, red in tooth and claw. And that behavior of mining, once we are at extreme electrical price sensitivity in that perfect market, that's what Bitcoin mining looks like in the future. That's where we are going to be long term, provided we don't have another massive run up in price. Then it'll behave like it did in the snapshot. What we have to get regulators to see is the intrinsic nature of Bitcoin mining and where it's headed, rather than fixating on this one spot where, some town in New York had a bunch of miners moving and it pushed up the price of electricity temporarily.
So I kind of look at it as like Darwin's finches, where these birds on the Galapagos Islands would specialize in different niches. Some would eat insects, some would eat nuts. And that's what's happening in the mining industry, is we're infiltrating almost every single industry, agriculture, municipal solid waste, whether it's flare gas mining or mining off of waste, right? We've got, the big industrials, but they're all fitting into different niches, including district heating, up in Canada, and I think that is making us stronger and more resilient because they can't shut down home heaters, right? And like every industry, so farmers are using the heat, for example, or taking their waste and generating Bitcoin. And the more industries that are infiltrated, the more people and businesses will stand up for mining. So it's going to be very hard to tear that industry down long term. And then a second important point that I think we need to make is, you look at the electricity grid and the electricity system, and traditionally it tends to be underfunded. And you look at low carbon investments, we're underfunded by trillions of dollars. And typically it's like the taxpayer pocket or the ratepayer pocket, but people have to pay. And politicians don't like taking your money because they're not going to get reelected. We offer a third pocket, Bitcoin mining, because it's built on economic incentives. And if there's an incentive to mine, because you're using waste or whatnot, like you're going to help build out this more resilient grid with that capital, or we're subsidizing renewables like in Texas. So I think that could be a powerful story towards politicians, which is like, no, you don't need to spend more capital to shore up public infrastructure. Perhaps mining can help out.
Well, I want to bring it back a little bit to the question of states, right? Texas is a great success case, but obviously a red state. We live in a divided country right now. Are there other states that you all see as having potential success? Obviously New York, maybe there's setbacks there. Other states that you're looking at, maybe Mags will stick with you.
I tend to focus a little bit more on Canada, but I know, Texas is
provinces, maybe a province out there that we should hear about.
BC, so if any province in Canada is going to do it, it's probably going to be the Texas of Canada, which is Alberta. We have a lot of oil.
Alberta, on the map.
I see a lot of positivity there in terms of companies, lobbying, politicians. I think that's where probably we'll see big moves. Quebec right now is looking at, throttling the sector, and that's a bad news story, because as soon as you hear about places like Quebec, like New York, other jurisdictions, like I as a policymaker, I would be like, what's this jurisdiction doing and why? Should I be doing it? So that's a concern. So just because, this isn't happening in my state, it could be a concern because your state is looking at that. But I think Texas is now like pretty solid and embedded, knowing that's where, they go. And I think you can speak more to that.
Yeah, so we are, Riot, we are 100% focused on Texas. Our model is large industrial sites, leveraging economies of scale as much as possible. And in fact, now we're building a second large site, but it's still within 2 hours of the first, so everything is still in one location. So our focus is on Texas. And Texas has proven to be a great opportunity, and I'm going to get to other states shortly. I don't mean to harp on Texas forever. Obviously, I love it. Texas has an energy grid with an incredible amount of capacity in it. So that is a key factor that makes it great for Bitcoin mining. But other states that are coming around, I think, are seen and are becoming more friendly. For example, North Dakota, Kentucky, Tennessee, Montana, Wyoming. They don't have grids at the same size, but they do have opportunities there. So we are seeing miners go to those jurisdictions more. And I think it's kind of, the model just eventually becomes impossible to ignore when you see the benefits.
Troy, your take on that?
Just real quickly, I was pretty surprised to see Cambridge's analysis put Georgia at by far the number one, and maybe some of that's migrated. There was some high power pricing in Georgia, but it was like dominant over Texas.
Right, yeah.
And I do I do think I like Dennis Porter's approach of going kind of state by state with the mining efforts. Something that we're going to see, because the margins are getting razor thin right now, is we're going to see evolution happen, right? We're going to see natural selection. And what you want as a miner is not just cheap power, but you want lawmakers that you know are going to like at least consider your interests, and local politicians. And so you're going to see this sort itself out. I think the market was not efficient, actually. And this pressure, price pressure from all the sides, like hash rate, electricity, Bitcoin price being down, it's going to force migration into the cheapest pockets. And what does that look like? It means mining on waste energy, vented methane. I think that stranded renewables, curtailed renewables, are finally going to start penciling out once ASICs are dirt cheap and they don't require that much uptime. Finally, that narrative will come good. So I feel like the story, it's just weird to say in this moment, but the story we have to tell lawmakers is actually gotten much, much better. And because a lot of their take was based on this weird moment, we're moving into a perfectly competitive market. In some ways, it's brutal. I know, I feel for people out there who are building and suffering with these prices. But that's what Bitcoin is about. That's why it's different from proof of stake. You don't just sit on your laurels. It's about proof of work. You have to get out there and compete. That's why big players can go under and upstarts can make their way if they make smart decisions. That's markets making decisions and not policymakers. And I think that's a great story for Bitcoin.
Well, it does seem like there's this emergent green energy narrative, stranded waste energy narrative, but at the same time, it seems like that's having trouble penetrating the higher levels of government conversation, right?
We got it in the OSTP report. They acknowledged that.
Right, but it felt even then, I think, a bit like an afterthought. So I guess why are they still skeptical of this?
It's small scale right now. And waste heat is small scale, but it's not going to remain small scale. And flexibility, too. How much flexibility do you need for a grid to be decarbonizing? Well, we do have a white paper on that in the ERCOT grid that said 85% uptime will be net carbon negative. Well, hey, we're hitting those numbers now. That's a reality. So basically, the story hasn't caught up to the reality.
Well, we also talked a bit about the lobbying that's being done in the crypto industry. We talked about proof of stake and Ethereum's move to the merge, cutting the carbon emissions from that blockchain. Mags, maybe you can take us into this argument. How do we counter this in the conversations that we're having?
Sometimes I wonder if it's a bit of a reframing. I'm still waiting for the life cycle assessment studies to catch up that show that between gold mining and traditional banking, Bitcoin wins just on an ESG. It's more, both the GHG front, but also on the social side, right? There's benefits to banking people that hasn't permeated. It's not sexy. And so we need to figure out what's sexy to politicians, right? And I think the local stories really resonate at the local municipal level. So we need to start scaling that. And I think Texas, has done a good job about bringing jobs in, but we haven't gotten that federally, and typically that's where the currency sits, so it's going to be a challenge. So it's I do think it depends on who you talk to. If you're talking to an economic development minister, it's jobs, it's FDI attraction, right? If you're talking to an environmental minister, it's look, we have proven we're reducing GHGs through flaring. Oh, you've got waste tires that are burning in a landfill? We've got the solution here for you. So depending on who you talk to, that story will have to change, and we have to, market it specifically. So I think that's what's going to.
Well, I think the question is, when does the environmental side of the lobbying groups, when do they wake up to this? Troy, is there a path there, or you just think they're not going to hear it?
I mean, I think it might be like the nuclear industry. It might be a long, long time.
Well,
and at some level, at some level, I've had so many of these discussions now where it's hey, surprisingly, Bitcoin mining, even though it uses a lot of energy, is actually helping us to build a newer, more resilient grid. It's helping us to deal with waste methane. It can help us electrify heating. This is an amazing story, and I get tremendous amount of pushback. And when you get into the pushback, you find out that people just don't see the value of Bitcoin itself, or they see it as just exactly the same as proof of stake, except using more energy, or they have a fundamental philosophical disagreement about who gets to make decisions about using energy. I think as an industry, the root political question is something like, if energy production has externalities, if it has effects on the environment, who's responsible for those effects and how do you distribute that? And for some policymakers, their answer to that question is, we get to choose what we think are good uses of energy and bad uses of energy, prohibit or tax the bad ones, reward the good ones with that option. The other alternative is you don't make those decisions as policymakers. If you want to tax an externality, you tax like the carbon, you tax the energy, but you don't tax one particular use of it and decide that using a computer to hash should be regulated, but using a computer to stream videos should not, right? That's all kind of philosophically where we have to, I think, take a stand, make that issue come to the fore, and argue for the freedom of end use of energy, provided it's paid for.
Good policy is tech agnostic, period. You can't pick the winners and losers, because we have seen government fails to pick the winner typically, because what happens is, they grease some palms or something. So we have to be tech agnostic and keep hitting them with that.
I think we got time for one more question here. There was a talking point we brought up earlier, this idea of carbon negative, right? Not just carbon neutral, and that being sort of a new North Star potentially for the mining industry. Curious, what does the path look like? Mags, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, so I worked on low carbon economic transition. So tech that would get us to low carbon and below. So net negative means you're not just no carbon, you're actually removing carbon from the atmosphere. And our industry is already, doing that. There are miners that are in agriculture or in landfill where methane is being released, and methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So if you're actually providing that service where you're converting methane to CO2, you're carbon negative, because you're benefiting the planet, because there's less carbon being released. Less GHG potent gases being released. And so this is the only industry that can get there. Proof of stake won't get there. And we're gonna find other cases where we remove carbon, or maybe even subsidize carbon removal, because we're almost like the subsidy in the market. And I think that's the key part that we need to hit home on, because I've seen studies recently on landfill gas, and they don't even talk about our industry, right? It's not just, educating politicians, it's adjacent industries that could benefit that we need to educate.
We got one more minute. Final thoughts on carbon negative. Jason, curious, is this on your roadmap? Is this something you think about as the CEO?
So I think at Riot, our strategy, like I talked about, is the large industrial scale loads on the grid. And I think that is the major sphere of power that we're helping to influence. And I think indirectly, that does work with the renewable generation as well. One statistic that it's probably mind-blowing for people to know, there is more renewable energy curtailed in West Texas than all Bitcoin miners in Texas actually use. And Bitcoin mining is a tool to fix that inefficiency, and I think is a tool to incentivize more generation development, both renewable and other types of baseload sources. So I think by being buyers of power of last resort and continuing to be flexible with our ability to shut off and respond when the grid needs, I think is demonstrating the value add of Bitcoin mining on the energy grid, and I think the benefits will just grow from here.
Troy, final thoughts on the path forward?
Real quick, CH4 is 84 times as warming as CO2 over a 20-year period. It's what the UN calls our most effective lever in the fight against climate change. And Bitcoin miners are really the best users of stranded methane in landfills and agricultural facilities, wastewater treatment facilities worldwide. It's actually pretty cool and exciting if you care about climate change. My calculation, seat of the pants, and partly based on Daniel Batten's calculations, is that if 1/30 of all hashing is done roughly, on vented methane, then the entire network would be carbon equivalent neutral. And I think that's a not ridiculous goal. I think we can get there in 5 years or less.
Wow. Thanks for the panel, everybody, and we'll be around backstage to talk. Take care and see you next time.